Hi, I'm Ed Spur, and I'm the Clinical Information Librarian at the Augusta University of Georgia Medical Partnership here in Athens, Georgia. And today we're going to take just a couple of minutes to discuss the potential impacts of the OSTP mandate on the biomedical literature. So in terms of what this new mandate says, basically everybody that gets federal funding is going to have to deposit the peer-reviewed outputs of that funding into some sort of agency-designated repository. And again, in some ways, this looks a lot like the current public access policy, where NIH grantees have to put their stuff into PubMed Central. But one of the important differences between this new policy and the old policy is that there's no longer a 12-month embargo. So there's no longer 12 months where things could sit in PMC and not be available. Now things have to be freely available for folks to read as soon as they get published in the journal. So this new policy is not going to take place overnight, but it is going to happen pretty soon. We're already in the period where all federal agencies that deliver grants to grantees should have some sense of what their policy is going to look like going forward, what repository they're going to designate. And the big deadline in terms of looking for what those policies are going to look like exactly is December 31st, 2024. So at that point, every agency covered by this should have promulgated their policy to the public. Within a year of that, those policies have to be in force. So again, by December 31st, 2025, we can expect to see some pretty significant differences in the scholarly publication landscape. So probably the most basic question is exactly how much stuff we're talking about. I mean, if it's just a little bit of stuff, then maybe nobody really cares. If it's just a little bit of additional publicly accessible stuff at the moment of publication, that may not really change the calculus in terms of what authors or librarians or publishers do. But if that proportion gets larger, then maybe we start to see different market forces take effect. So probably the most basic question is trying to define exactly what proportion of the biomedical literature is going to be covered by this policy. That is, what proportion is currently federally funded. Has that proportion changed over time? And finally, does that proportion vary all that much if we're talking about individual subsets, individual kinds of things? So the way I try to answer these questions is by using PubMed. I like PubMed, so that's one reason I turn to it first, but also PubMed's a really good fit for this question because PubMed has very broad coverage of the biomedical literature. Not just researchy stuff, but also things like treatment guidelines, letters to the editor, all kinds of things that our patrons want to see. And also PubMed has broad geographic coverage as well. So we think of it as being a United States database, but it actually covers a lot of other places besides. But finally, PubMed is a government database. And we have a pretty good sense that the folks at NIH that are ultimately responsible for this database have some sense of what they're funding. And indeed, if we look at individual records in PubMed, we oftentimes see those grant fields telling us not only that a particular agency has sponsored an article, but even what particular grant number that article is derived from. And again, we can find that stuff in PubMed by using a hedge. And this is actually just a couple of different hedges that I ANDed together and took out some extraneous terms or reproduced terms. But we can see this at funding support, information in Medline/PubMed, and this reference is on my last slide. So by using this hedge, we can identify things that are federally funded inside the database. And once we identify those federally funded items, then all we have to do is take the ratio to figure out how much stuff is going to be covered by this policy going forward, or get some sense of how much stuff is going to be covered by this policy going forward. So we can say to a pretty good degree of certainty that 10.97% of all PubMed items derive from federal funding. These numbers change a little bit over time. They go down a little bit if we're talking about just the past 10 years or just the past 5 years. I don't think those are huge differences though. If instead we look at those items that are just indexed for Medline, so things found by the Medline subset search, that gets us to 12% of all of those items. That actually goes up a little bit if we're looking at just the past 10 years, it goes down a little bit if we're looking at the past 5. If instead we look at things that are in English that are in the total database, that gets us to 12.66%. That goes down kind of significantly, maybe, if we're talking about just the past 5 years, goes down to 9.73. But finally, if we're talking about things found by the very broad medical subject heading, and of course letting that expand automatically in the database, United States, that gets us to almost 2 out of 10, or 18.23%, if we're talking about the database as a whole. And perhaps even more significantly, if we're talking about the past 10 years, that's 32.42%. Past 5 years, 33.44%. So again, if we're thinking about looking forward and using the last 5 years as an indication of what these articles are going to look like in the future, we can expect to see a little over 3 out of 10 articles that are about the United States in one way or another that are going to be covered by this mandate. If we search by item type, we can say that if we look at adaptive clinical trials, many of those are federally funded. Goes down a little bit if we're talking about phase 1 clinical trials, goes down a little bit more still if we're talking about the entire universe of randomized controlled trials. That's at 14.32%. And probably not too surprisingly, if we're talking about something like a case report, those are hardly ever derived from federal funding at only 2.16%. And kind of interestingly, I thought, another low number in terms of being derived from federal funding is phase 4 clinical trials. So I imagine maybe those are more often sponsored by the pharmaceutical company that's sort of shepherding a drug through the discovery and approval process. Those are only 5.4% federally funded if we look at the database as a whole. Another thing I thought kind of interesting if we take a look at this notion of publication types is that many times reviews are actually federally funded. So if we look at all kinds of reviews, that's 11.64% for the database as a whole are subject to federal funding or derived from federal funding. And interestingly, even if we talk about systematic reviews, 5.79% of those are federally funded. Another thing I thought was kind of interesting is that many times when we're thinking about this question, we sort of put research support from governmental agencies in a completely different position from non-governmental agencies. But actually, there's a kind of significant overlap. So 19.48% of all research support non-US government publication type items are also federally funded as well. Another thing we could do is take a look at individual topics. Again, by doing medical subject heading searches and combining it with our federal funding hedge, we can say that dermatology, general practice, and pathology are hardly ever federally funded. That probably is not too surprising. Though in the last case, that did go up to almost 10% if we're just looking at the last 5 years. But on the other hand, disciplines that we think of being perhaps more research-based or having more research items within them are many times much more significantly federally funded. So biochemistry, 17%, biophysics 25%, physiology 17%. But probably the most significant finding when we're looking at this database and looking at individual searches is thinking about things that are published in or about the United States. That's kind of a hard concept to get to. I did find one hedge on the UAB Library's hedge page where they sort of put together a bunch of different affiliation fields, a bunch of different medical subject headings, a bunch of different keywords, trying to get to this broad notion of things from or about the United States. And if we take a look at that United States hedge, we can say that for the entirety of the database, almost 40% of those things are federally funded. That kind of goes down if we're talking about just the past 5 years. But again, even just the 5 years, that's still almost 33%. So if we're talking about things that deal with the United States or things that are published from the United States, which again is things that we might think that our patrons have a particular interest in if we're working here in the States, that's a really large amount. And so that really starts to maybe influence our decision making going forward if we think about all of these things being publicly available from the moment of publication. So if we're talking about the potential impact of a new mandate, it's worth looking at how much is freely available now. Now, if we take a look at the entire database, combining that federal funding hedge with the free full text subset, we see that not everything is available. Indeed, only about half of all federally funded items are publicly available now. But we know that a lot of those things are old items before the current public access policy took effect, or the things that might be covered by the 12-month embargo. And if we sort of tighten up our date range and we say April 7th, 2008 to April 1st, 2022, we can say that 82.37% of those items are currently available for the public to read. Now, the numbers I've demonstrated actually match up pretty well with other investigations. So if we take a look at some of the other papers where people have used other databases, including Web of Science, Dimensions database, whatever they did at OSTP, we could say that the numbers we came up with in terms of things from the United States or dealing with the United States are pretty much in line with the numbers these other investigators came up with. But finally, we want to talk about what this actually means for the scholarly publication system. And I do have quotes there because I do think the scholarly publication system is a system in name only, a system much like our healthcare system. We call it a system in the United States. It's really just a whole bunch of different individual actors doing their thing and interacting with each other. But I do think that this change to no more 12-month embargoes is going to be pretty significant. In one sense, it'll make it a lot easier to track compliance, because I do want to note that even when we limited that search of federally funded things that are currently publicly available to that date window, which they should be covered by current public access policy, it wasn't 100%, it was about 83%. But also, if we know going forward that anything federally funded is going to be publicly available for folks to read at the moment of publication, maybe that starts to factor into people's decision making in terms of what kinds of journals they want to keep their subscriptions for. And also, this may start to change publisher decision making. And already we're starting to see some indications from different publishers sort of seeing the writing on the wall saying, hey, maybe gold open access isn't necessarily the worst idea in the world. Maybe that's something we want to try out. And so this does get to this notion of leverage. Now, again, this policy is going to be a pretty significant change, but it's not current policy. But the Wellcome Foundation, the Gates Foundation do have something in place that's pretty close to what this policy is going to look at, and that they require authors that are funded by their monies to immediately deposit things for immediate access in Europe PMC or US PMC without any embargo at all. Elsevier, as an example of one publisher, says that they're happy to comply with this. But if any authors want to publish in their journals, they have to pay an article processing charge, rather. They're not going to make any special accommodations for them. And so basically trying to funnel everybody that is covered by these mandates into an explicit gold open access model. Now, maybe that's one thing that you might be able to sort of do, because you have a lot of leverage in terms of talking about just a couple of items here and there. Wellcome and Gates Foundation do good work, but they don't fund everybody. But does this stance still work if we're talking about anywhere from 10 to 30% of all the items going into your journal going forward? Does this sort of change the calculus in terms of who exactly has the leverage in this situation? And also, is the response by publisher or by libraries going to change in terms of by what discipline you're looking at? On the publisher side, I mean, with all of the consolidation in the industry, there's probably not too many publishers really that just specialize in one field. Everybody has broad portfolios that cover all kinds of different things. Here are the references for those different hedges and those different articles. I encourage you to take a look at those. And finally, we do have a couple of minutes for questions and discussion, so I welcome that. If you want to send me any questions that you think of later on, please feel free to email me. And the code and data for this project will be up at this link, the Open Science Foundation. Thank you very much. I look forward to discussing things now.